Howdy my totally tubular gamers, we're back with, you guessed it, another video. Thanks for coming back to the channel. If you're new here, maybe stick around for a while. I got a fun video for you. Today we're going to be talking about the hardest first-person shooters. I've talked about some of the hardest games I've ever played. I've talked about some of the hardest games on N64. Well, today we're doing a genre. Today we're going to talk about what are, in my opinion, the 10 hardest FPS games. Now, I'm not making this exclusive to newer FPS titles or the ancient old boomer shooters of yore. It really is just the 10 hardest first-person shooters I've played ever. I can confidently say I've played hundreds of first-person shooters at this point, and some of them have been really challenging over the years, and for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's hit-scanning enemies all over the place, sometimes you just get swarmed by bullshit enemies, sometimes the level design kind of sucks and there's a bunch of choke points, sometimes you just get completely lost in these areas with labyrinthian maze-like levels that you just spend hours and hours key hunting in. Sometimes the game is just super stingy on ammo or health pickups, etc. We're looking at everything here. As always with my hardest games list, I'm looking at just a normal playthrough of the game. I'm not talking about, oh, if you play on the hardest difficulty, this game is super hard. No, just a normal everyday playthrough that I think the average player is going to experience on either the medium or normal difficulty, and it doesn't need to be like with a completionist mentality either. We're talking about, again, just getting through the game on a normal playthrough. Otherwise, this list would look completely different. I'll just give an honorable mention right here. Call of Duty World at War, if you play through the campaign on Veteran, that is one of the hardest first-person shooters ever made. And it's easily the hardest Call of Duty campaign, but I'm pretty sure 9, maybe 9.5 out of 10 people don't play through the campaign on Veteran. The average player is probably going to play on normal, and at times, yeah, World at War can be a little challenging, but not enough to get on this list. The point I'm trying to make with all this is we're just talking about a normal playthrough here. I also haven't played every single first-person shooter ever made. I've played a lot of them, but not all of them, so let me know down below some games I might be missing or what you think I should try. I'm always on the hunt for more games, and the comments are usually littered with awesome, great games, so thank you very much in advance for any comment. I really do appreciate it, and the last thing I want to mention is difficulty is subjective. What I find super difficult, you might not find. Some games that I found incredibly hard, you might find super easy. It's all about the person. This is just my personal experience. You can let me know down below what you think the hardest games are, and we can really get a conversation going. As always, please like, share, comment, subscribe. I got the Patreon and the super thanks. Any support is truly greatly appreciated. Seriously, thank you so much. I really do love all of you. And so let's just get right into it. What's number 10? It was a bit of a toss-up for this last spot, but I'm going with Halo 2. I believe that Halo 2 is the hardest of the Halo campaigns, even on just the normal difficulty. You can even play this game in co-op, and I still would say that it's a decent challenge. It's pretty easy to forget just how hard this game can be at times. Some parts of Halo 2 are pretty easy. Like, they're not really going to give you much of a challenge, but then some levels, yeah, the game can actually get pretty hard. It kind of goes up and down with its difficulty. There's certainly some big spikes here, and it at times can feel a little unbalanced, but even on just the normal difficulty, there are plenty of levels where I spent several minutes just dying and trying over and over and over. I mean, the level that immediately comes to mind is the part of the game with the Jackal snipers. This part of the game can just straight up fuck off. When I was younger, I hated this shit. When I came back for the anniversary edition, I remember just how much I hate this shit, and then when I played the PC version a few years later, I was like, yeah, every time I played this level, it is shit. It is trial and error bullshit where you just die, try again, die, try again. Hopefully you made it a bit further this time, and it really makes you wonder just how much QA they did for this part of the game. They probably didn't do much. And while that is the most egregious part of the difficulty, it's not the only hard part to the game. Towards the end of the game, yeah, it does start to get pretty challenging. I mean, it is the end of the game. What would you expect? Thankfully, it doesn't get Jackal sniper bullshit hard, but it gets pretty challenging. The AI in the older Halo games is actually pretty smart. They're incredibly reactive, and at times they can be pretty tricky to kill. And I mean, that's especially true in Halo 2. Some of the enemies can just wipe the floor with you. It's like they know what you're gonna do or something. And it feels like they only get smarter and smarter the further you get through the game, and there's plenty of battles that, yeah, I had to try quite a few times. And of course you can play the game co-op where someone hangs back and the other person just keeps running in and dying, hoping that they get a little further every time and killing another enemy or two. But that almost feels like an exploit to a degree, and there's a few parts to the game where that just straight up won't work. Like when they drop you into an environment and you just get swarmed everywhere, you can't just hide back. and do that. Not like you could in, say, Halo Infinite, where it's pretty generous with the respawning. If I was going to include playing through games on the hardest difficulty, oh, Halo 2 would be near the very top of the list. Playing through this game on Legendary is an absolute nightmare. It is absolutely ridiculous. It is just a straight up gauntlet, and I don't think anybody should try it. The Jackal sniper part just becomes a straight up meme. It's so absurdly difficult, but I'm not in difficulty modes for this list, so it's only in the number 10 spot, but I still think Halo 2 is a decently challenging game. And so our next game is not a game I think I've ever talked about on the channel, and that is Stalker Shadow of Chernobyl. I will preface and say that this legit is like one of my favorite first-person shooters of all time. I played the crap out of this game in high school, and I'll just say this is a pretty challenging first-person shooter, especially for your first few hours of the game. And yes, I'm very aware that there are mods that fix the shooting, that balance the game out a little bit more. You can even get mods that add cars. There's actually some really cool mods for this game, but I'm not including those mods, and I always played this game on the normal difficulty. I've heard on the harder difficulties that the game is actually allegedly easier, but I cannot confirm nor deny this. I've just played the game on the normal difficulty, and I'll say I died a shit ton of times in this game, especially the first time I played it. Stalker can be a pretty uncompromising, brutal game at times. The game is actually a survival game way before survival games became cool, and managing all of your resources and staying alive that way certainly adds a bit to the challenge, but what really makes this game as challenging as it is really is two things: the environment and then the firefights. The environment, or as it's known in the game as the zone, is one of the main appeals, one of the main draws to this game. It's a fascinating place, and it's also trying to fuck with you constantly, where there's just all these weird little anomalies all over the place. Some of them are really obvious what they are, and some of them really aren't, where you just are walking around and all of a sudden there's like these blasts of energy around you, or there's electricity all over the place, and you just die instantly. And a big part of the game, a big part of the gameplay loop is understanding where these anomalies are and how to deal with them and how to get through them. And if you actually manage to get past them or get to the center of them, you're usually given some kind of reward, but you're probably going to die a lot of times just trying to even get past these things, or you just forget they're even there and they kill you like that. But eventually you'll learn about all the anomalies and you'll figure out how to deal with every single one. But then we have the firefights. The firefights in Stalker can get rather difficult. The shooting isn't amazing. The guns look and feel pretty nice, but the shooting just isn't very good. The guns just don't really behave like how you would think. You will aim and shoot at an enemy and your bullets will just whiz past them even though your reticle is right on them. It straight up just feels random at times whether or not you're going to actually hit the enemy, and it pretty much goes the same for them. Sometimes they will shoot at you a bunch and they'll hit you every single time and you'll die really fast, and other times it feels like they miss every other shot. It's just kind of all up in the air, and so what this leads to is just incredibly inconsistent firefights where sometimes you will walk into a building and just get mowed down like that, and other times you'll wipe the floor with them, or it'll be a decent back and forth. You just never really know with this game. What I do know though is that the beginning of the game is like the hardest part of the game, where you have the shittiest weapons, and the firefights just take seemingly forever as you just go back and forth, hitting each other, tagging each other until one of you finally drops dead. And yeah, that doesn't sound too fun, and it really isn't, but I've heard some people go through the beginning of the game and not have like any trouble at all, so I guess that shows just how truly random the firefights can be in this game. On top of all of this, some of the quests you get are a bit tricky, and they'll have you navigating some kind of confusing areas, especially towards the end of the game, but it's nothing too crazy. There are two other Stalker games that have been released, Clear Sky and Call of Pripyat, and both of those games can be challenging, but I never found them as hard as Shadow of Chernobyl. Maybe it's because I knew what to expect, but yeah, I just didn't find them as hard. I'm really excited for Stalker 2, and I'm curious to see if it's going to be as hard as this original game is. But either way, this original game, yeah, it's a challenging game. And so here we actually have a modern game. We have Doom Eternal and its two DLCs, The Ancient Gods. Now, Doom Eternal is a fantastic game. Nobody is denying that. It is one of the best first-person shooters in the last, decade, but this game can get pretty challenging, especially when The Ancient Gods Part 1 comes in. Then yeah, this game actually gets really challenging. And that's just on the normal difficulty. I know if you play Doom Eternal on the harder difficulties, yeah, this game is not fucking around. Doom Eternal requires pretty good reflexes, knowledge of all of the weapons, and you might even need to know some of the arenas/level design. You just need to constantly be moving in this game, otherwise you're going to get absolutely ass blasted by every single type of enemy. Outside of the basic zombie type enemy that you're supposed to kill basically for ammunition, every single enemy type is incredibly deadly in this game. They can all easily wreck your day, some though a lot easier than others, like the ones that revive other enemies. Oh, those guys are a real pain in the dick. The level design can also be pretty deadly with plenty of dead ends. There's some serious platforming in this game, and you'll find yourself sometimes moving so fast all over the place that you just either fly off the map or you end up in a dead end and the enemy just blows you up. There's also these areas that slow down the player's speed, and these are just a death trap if you get stuck in them, and they're all over the first DLC. That first DLC is probably even harder than the main game, and I feel like they didn't mean for it to be that hard because the second part is not as hard. It still is a challenging time though. The final boss for the DLC and the main game are actually pretty difficult as well and will require a little bit of trial and error. But I wouldn't say Doom Eternal is like stupidly difficult. It is one of the harder first-person shooters, but it's a very fair hard where the game absolutely will reward you if you get good at it. You just need to practice a bit. Get accustomed to what the game throws at you, and then you'll start ripping and tearing before you know it. The enemies can destroy your shit, but you can absolutely rip them to shreds as well, and it's incredibly satisfying, especially when you die a few times on one of the challenges or a certain battle arena's really just giving you a lot of trouble, then you finally are able to overcome it. Oh yeah, it's a really great feeling, and it makes it all totally worth it. Doom Eternal, absolutely recommend this game to the fullest, but it's not the easiest game in the world, that's all I'll say. And so here we have a hard game I've talked about before, a repeat offender if you will. We have Turok 2 Seeds of Evil. Now the original Turok was decently challenging as well. I'll even give it an honorable mention here, Turok 1. But Turok 2 really ramps things up quite a bit. It doesn't matter if you're playing the N64 original or the remaster, it's a challenging game. While it certainly doesn't start all that difficult, you're just kind of killing dinosaurs with bows and arrows and going through a relatively linear environment, it quickly, and I mean quickly, becomes a hell of a lot more complicated and just complex. It's one of the most complex N64 games of them all. You'll be fighting a lot more than some basic ass dinosaurs, and you'll have a lot more weapons than just a bow and arrow. You get a ton of awesome, amazing weapons in this game, but you'll fight some enemies that can absolutely wipe the floor with you, where you can shred the enemies, but they can shred the shit out of you too. And we're not talking about no Tony Hawk or Skate here, we're talking about where they turn you into just a pile of blood. But hey, you can very easily do the same to them. What I'm trying to say is by the end of the game, you'll be challenged every single firefight and you'll be scrambling for ammo. And so the firefights can be challenging. The first game had challenging firefights as well, but what really makes Turok 2 as difficult as it is the collectibles, the level design, and having to do all of the objectives. Even with a walkthrough, this is a confusing ass game. Like almost all of the levels, really all of the levels outside of the first one, are very complex, long, and labyrinthian at times. The lair of the blind ones, oh, don't even get me started. I was on this area for hours. You just get so lost in some of these levels. Not only does like everything look the same, but they just keep going on and on and on, and enemies just keep swarming you, and it feels like you just have a ton of objectives to do in these levels as well. You have to do every single objective to clear the area, and then there's also collectibles on top of that, and you need to find all the collectibles in order to beat the game. And these are hidden in some real hard to find places. Again, even with a walkthrough, I still struggle to find everything and complete all of the objectives. I spent a majority of my time in this game just wandering around trying to figure out either where to go next or where to find the next collectible or objective. And then when I finally get to the end of the level, I'm like, oh, finally, I can go on to the next area. That was such a complex level only to find out, no, your ass ain't going nowhere. You didn't complete all the objectives. You didn't find the collectibles. You basically have to redo the entire level over because you need to comb every single square inch of the map. And again, even with a walkthrough, it still can be incredibly confusing because so many areas look the same. I'm certain if you know where all the objectives and collectibles are in this game, you can probably finish it in a few hours. Otherwise, you can double, if not triple, how long it's going to take you to beat the game. It took me over 10 hours to get to the end of this game because, again, I was just wandering, looking for everything, and barely being able to scrape by the respawning enemies. I feel like Turok 2 is kind of slept on, and I mean that in terms of difficulty and the game's quality. Like, it's a really challenging game that I feel like a lot of people just almost forget about, and then the game is actually pretty good, despite how challenging it is and despite how labyrinthian some of these levels are. Seriously, fuck the lair of the blind ones. I still think it is a good ass game. It might even be the best Turok game, but you're gonna do a hell of a lot of wandering. I'd play the Fallout Wandering song for you, but you know, copyright. You know the song where they're like, oh, I'm a wanderer, I roam around. You know, I'll play like 5 seconds of it. Maybe YouTube won't get mad. Alright, so our next game is the game Blood. Now, I've never talked about this game on the channel either. I love the original Blood. It is one of the best boomer shooters of the 90s, but it's also one of the hardest. Like, Blood really is just one of those old school difficult first-person shooters. You know the ones where they put you in decently complex levels where you gotta key hunt and all of the enemies can just wreck your shit like immediately. Basically, all of the enemies with projectiles have hit scanning weapons, so the moment they see you, they can just start hurting your character and start doing some serious mondo damage. Like, they can just destroy you in literal seconds. Even if they're super far away, they have crazy good accuracy and they can just rock your shit. Like, I've been gunned down so many times by the cultists with Tommy guns just because they got the drop on me. If an enemy gets the drop on you in this game, it's likely you're just gonna die. Unless you're near full health, even on the normal difficulty, they're just gonna gun you down super fast. And on the harder difficulties, oh, you're just dead. On top of this, the enemy placement can be kinda tricky at times. They'll put some enemies in some areas that are hard to get to, hard to even see, or they'll just straight up use cheap tactics, like you walk into a room and then all the way to the right is an enemy that starts shooting at you immediately. You know, that classic old school bullshit where the only way you could have really known that enemy is there is because you walked in and either got shot or likely killed by that enemy, so now when you walk into the room you know immediately just to go over there and kill them before they can get you. This game is just full of moments like that. It is a rather punishing FPS, but you do get some pretty awesome weapons. You can also really fuck yourself up in this game. You get some dynamite, and I've blown myself up way too many times. I mean, in just the process of understanding how the dynamite works, you're probably going to kill yourself at least once or twice. I mean, I killed myself several times, I'm not afraid to admit it. I mean, this is the original Blood we're talking about, and since we are talking about it, I can also tell you about the level design. The level design is decently complex in this game. It's very similar to Duke Nukem 3D where you gotta find keys, and sometimes these levels, yeah, they get a bit maze-like, and you will find yourself just kind of wandering looking for the next key. I didn't find it particularly egregious. I didn't spend a stupid amount of time looking for the next key or where I'm supposed to go, but there certainly were a few times where I was like, I have no idea where I'm supposed to go and it is not super clear. There's also the expansion levels that are really not messing around and not as well made in my opinion. The original Blood is a pretty excellent first-person shooter that still just doesn't get enough love, but it is a very challenging first-person shooter. Again, it's that old school difficulty where you're going to be mashing that F6 button, quick saving and quick loading just constantly because an enemy either got the drop on you or you just weren't properly prepared, or it's just more trial and error. You just gotta try over and over, but as the main character Caleb says at the beginning of the game, I live again. You'll live again, you'll try again, and eventually you'll get through it. And so from one old school game to the next, here we have the original Shadow Warrior. I'm not talking about the rebooted trilogy, no, I'm talking about that original game, the build engine game. Yes, it is another build engine game like Blood, and when it comes to the difficulty, it very much is old school. Everything I said for Blood really applies for Shadow Warrior, where the enemies can absolutely just tear you to pieces incredibly fast. If an enemy gets the drop on you in Shadow Warrior, you're as good as dead, even on the normal difficulty. The enemy placement also can be rather tricky at times where they'll put them in hard to reach or see areas. They'll make it so the enemy constantly gets the drop on you and you'll have to redo sections over and over and know where all of the enemies are. The level design is also decently complex, where you'll have to go key hunting and you'll spend a fair bit of time just trying to figure out where to go next. It's not crazy complex or obtuse, and I don't really think you'll need a walkthrough, but sometimes it's just not super obvious where you're supposed to go, like when you're supposed to blow up walls or when you got to go through the odd platforming section. The platforming though, yeah, it's okay in this game. But I said it for Blood, I'll say it here, you're going to be mashing that quick save button where you just get gunned down, they get the drop on you, and you're going to be quick loading all the time. You got to save constantly in this game. You'll die several times in every single level, and at times this game really can get rather punishing. It even gets more punishing than Blood. I mean, it's higher than it on the list. I think the levels are just a bit more difficult, the enemy placement is just a little bit more bullshit, and I feel like the enemies can just tear you to pieces a little faster than they can in Blood. But if you've managed to beat Blood, I think you'll be able to beat this game. Of all the first-person shooters on the build engine, I think Shadow Warrior is the hardest of them. Duke Nukem 3D, I never thought it was really all that hard outside of a few levels. Redneck Rumpagi I thought was a decently difficult game, especially with the complex levels and the shooting being kinda ass. Blood, we already talked about, that's a difficult one, but Shadow Warrior, yeah, this one's the hardest. Like, you can just get fucked up so easily in this game at times, especially when any of like the explosive enemies show up. Oh, you just die so fast. Again, even on the the normal difficulty. On the harder difficulty levels, nearly everything can kill you in a few hits. But as I've said 1,000 frickin' times now, we aren't ranking them based on that, just a normal playthrough. And I think even with a normal playthrough, yeah, this is going to be a challenging game. The game was re-released, and I remember some people were worried they were going to tweak the difficulty or some other aspects of the game. No, it's uncompromised. It's still just as hard as it was then. It's a really challenging game that will test you. It's just an uncompromised, difficult boomer shooter that fans of the genre should absolutely seek out. Seriously, Shadow Warrior is a classic. Oh boy, another classic boomer shooter getting talked about here, and it is Rise of the Triad, the original game, not the 2013 reboot. Now, while this might be an old school shooter like Blood and Shadow Warrior, it does have some differences. The game actually runs on the Wolfenstein 3D engine rather than the Doom, Quake, or Build engine, so it's a bit more limited when it comes to the level design specifically. However, despite this, the game is still incredibly difficult and one of the hardest FPS games ever made. Like Blood and Shadow Warrior, the enemies hit like a freaking truck. They do not hold any punches back. The Triad aren't just rising up here, they are tearing you down to do so. They can just eat your health away faster than Wolf 3D ever did. The enemies can seriously change the tide of battle in seconds, and the further you get in the game, the more enemies that show up and the more annoying they get with their placement. This game is absolutely loaded with instances where enemies are just in borderline cheap areas. Not even just borderline, straight up cheap areas sometimes, where you get easily ambushed and then they get the drop on you. Where if you have low health and aren't super familiar with the enemy placement or level design, you really gotta take it slow and take your time. You'll certainly be taking your time in these levels. You cannot jump, but there's platforming and traps to avoid. The level design can be a real pain in the ass also. As much as the enemies and the key hunting can get quite tedious, the level design is decently complex, and sometimes it isn't crazy obvious where you're supposed to go next. Like so many other boomer shooters, you gotta wander and then wander some more. But once you get through the wandering, you get back to, getting your ass whooped. You get some cool weapons, you fight some difficult enemies, but Rise of the Triad, it is a pretty good FPS. It's pretty forgotten these days. It has been re-released, and yeah, there was the reboot, but the reboot might honestly be even more forgotten than the original game. That was a difficult game too, but the original, yeah, it's certainly more difficult. But despite all of that, I would say if you're looking for a difficult FPS, then I would recommend the game. Just be prepared for, difficult times ahead. Hey, at least I said difficult times ahead. I remember in 2020 when everybody went, these are uncertain times, and I don't know why I thought about that, but Rise of the Triad, it's a good game. Alright, so for this entry, I got a double whammy. I got Hexen 1 and Hexen 2. When it comes to the difficulty, I think they're pretty much equal. There is also Heretic and Heretic 2, but I don't think either of those games are anywhere near as hard. Now, Hexen runs off the Doom engine. Hexen 2 runs off the Quake engine. Both of them absolutely take those engines to the fullest, where they're medieval fantasy first-person shooters that play very much like Doom. There's a couple different classes that you can choose from, and they all do play relatively different from each other. It is actually pretty cool how different the classes are, but not all of the classes are equal. If you choose the melee build, you're probably going to have a bit of a harder time with this game in general. With both of these games being, older games, they definitely have that old school difficulty where, like I've said a few times now, the enemies can just completely tear you to pieces really quickly. They can get the drop on you and just completely ruin your day in seconds. And sometimes the placement of the enemies can be bullshit also, where there was just no way for you to have known that an enemy was there to get the drop on you unless you die to them. And again, both games have difficult enemy encounters. The thing is though, I wouldn't say the enemy encounters are as hard in this game as they are in Blood or Shadow Warrior. The game is a bit more forgiving, and fighting the enemies, at least on the normal difficulty, is not super punishing. Don't get it twisted, there are plenty of parts where yeah, they get the drop on you and it's over, but I didn't find it as hard as the previous two games. So then why is Hexen 1 and 2 higher than Shadow Warrior and Blood? It's the level design. The level design, along with the key hunting and the puzzle solving, like holy shit, this is one of the most cryptic video games ever made. This is Key Hunting the video game, where yeah, sometimes you get to blast stuff and it's pretty fun, but a majority of the game is wandering around trying to figure out where to go next, and then you'll pick up a key or flip a switch and you'll go, that did something somewhere and I have no idea where. And the thing about Hexen 1 and 2 is, like, all of the levels are connected. There's a hub area and then you can go to each of the levels, and so you'll flip a switch in one level and then another level something will happen and the game doesn't tell you shit. Or you'll get a key in one level and it's actually for a completely different level, and so you gotta do a bunch of back and forth, and yes, it is as tedious as it sounds. The game gives you basically no indication as to what you've activated or where the key goes, and it's gonna just take a lot of wandering and trying everything. This is one of those games that I don't think you should play without a guide. Like, make sure you have a guide or walkthrough on hand for Hexen 1 and 2. These games are just so ridiculously, absurdly cryptic, and are frequently just straight up obtuse. Like, there was literally no way I could have known that flipping the switch in one level activated like a bridge 2 levels prior. The only way I would have known that is from a guide or wandering aimlessly for who knows how long, and memorizing the level design to the point where I'd go, oh, that bridge actually wasn't down before, and that's a pretty obvious example. Sometimes it's not so obvious. It's like a door opened, and it's like, dude, all of this level and all of the previous 3 levels look almost the same. How the fuck am I supposed to remember that this door was closed and now it's open? You aren't. You need a guide. You won't make it past the first world without a guide unless you got a lot of time to spare. It is just unbelievably cryptic. Imagine Turok 2's Lair of the Blind Ones level, but that's just the entire game, and you have Hexen 1 and 2 when it comes to the level design, key hunting, puzzle solving, etc. Despite all of that, I think Hexen 2 is a pretty decent game. Hexen 1, man, I just couldn't fucking stand this game. Maybe I just had better expectations for the second one, but both games will certainly test your patience, and if you don't have a guide, yeah, just don't even bother playing them. They're just way too difficult and just overly complex. And so here we have not just one game in particular, but a series. For this entry, I'm choosing Rainbow Six. The Rainbow Six franchise has been around over 25 years now, and something all of the games really do have in common is that they are difficult, especially the older ones. Rainbow Six is a tactical, slow FPS that requires planning and patience, where you have to plan out your routes, plan not just your loadout, but your entire squad's loadout, and running in guns blazing will likely get you killed very fast, and that's just on the normal difficulty. In some of the older games, I've watched my whole squad get wiped out in a few seconds because I didn't properly prepare. So you really have to just take it slow, understand the map and objective, and take it seriously. Seriously, there are some missions in the earlier Rainbow Six games that I feel like I tried over and over and over. Like, you just have to know where the enemies are, you have to know how the map is laid out, and you can still get gunned down hella fast. I remember replaying some of the Rainbow Six 3 missions a ton of times as well. And again, all of this is just for the normal difficulty. On easy, I mean, you can kind of wing it, you can play a little loosely, but you can still get killed really fast. On the harder difficulties, oh, you ain't going nowhere unless you've practiced and you've really prepared. Your generally casual COD or Battlefield strats aren't going to work here, they just aren't. But at the very least, when you do finally complete one of these missions, it does feel incredibly rewarding, like you pulled off this big event since there was so much planning involved, and you know, you just barely make it by the skin of your teeth, or maybe you're hella raw at this game and you did just fine. Either way, it is quite rewarding. Later Rainbow Six games aren't as difficult, but they're still challenging. Vegas 1 and 2 are probably the hardest shooters of the 360 and PS3 era, requiring you to take things slower than, say, COD or Battlefield. Your team can still be wiped out relatively quickly. Planning ahead isn't really something you gotta do here though, it's more like you just gotta be tactical with your approach, you gotta take your time and have your squad mates really help you out, but the AI is actually pretty decent. There's a bunch of tactics you can do, but the enemies will frequently have the drop on you and can just destroy your life very quickly. And then of course there is Siege, which has a pretty decently sized learning curve for several reasons. Even the Terrorist Hunt mode is hard. Well, Terrorist Hunt mode is hard really in every Rainbow Six, with Vegas 2 being the most challenging terrorist hunt, in my opinion. One day I'll have to rank this series as it is very good, but it certainly is not for the impatient folk. Otherwise your characters are just going to be hitting the floor fast, and it's not because they're going prone, it's because your ass is getting gunned down real quick. Honestly, that kinda sounded better in my head. I guess what I'm trying to say is, your ass is grass and the enemies are the weed whacker, the terrorists are the weed whacker, but seriously, Rainbow Six, one of the most consistent FPS series of them all, and very consistent with its difficulty. And in the number 1 spot we have Final Doom. I know it's a bit weird to have 2 entries on this list as Doom games, but then have the whole Rainbow Six series, but hey, this is my list. I don't think a majority of the Doom games are hard enough to be on this list, and so yeah, there's Doom Eternal, but then there's Final Doom. Final Doom is without a doubt, in my mind, the hardest single-player FPS game that was at least commercially released. I'm sure there are mods and fan games that are way harder than this, but in terms of commercially released FPS games, yeah, I don't think it really gets any harder than Final Doom. Now, Final Doom is pretty interesting. It's actually very comparable to Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels. It's not like the next big step for the series. It's more like a remix of sorts for people who got, very, very good at the older games, and they just made it incredibly difficult. Like, just brutally difficult. It wasn't even made by id Software. It was made by modders and fans known as Team TNT, and then it was published by id Software. It doesn't feature like any new enemies, power-ups, weapons, or even gimmicks to the series. What it does is it just takes basically all of the assets from Doom 2 and just makes it incredibly difficult. Some of the hardest levels of not just any FPS, but like of any video game are in this game, where there are just mountains, and I mean mountains of enemies ready to kill you around every single corner. And it's not like the basic Doom enemies we're talking either. We're talking about like the really powerful Doom enemies, the Cyber Demon, the Archvile, the Spider Mastermind, like the hard-ass enemies of Doom games, if not bosses in Doom games. Yeah, they're just all over the place in this game. There's 2 episodes, the TNT Evolution and Platonia Experiment, and both of them are just super hard. Platonia is just crazy difficult. Like, you are just going to be dying over and over and over, and you're just going to have to try over and over and over. Even on just the normal shit, even the easy difficulty, this game is not fucking around. Like, I have just never seen an FPS slam you with so many difficult enemies, especially from pretty much the start of the game. I mean, the game is relentless. It's an absolute gauntlet. Like, it doesn't start easy and, gets pretty difficult. No, it just starts hard as fuck, and it only gets harder and harder to the point that it's not even a very good game. Like, sure, maybe I just need to get even better, but dying over and over, memorizing every level and enemy encounter, that's not the most fun. But it certainly means it's like the most difficult. I don't think any other single player FPS game really is as hard as Final Doom. The enemies can just mow you down. You're constantly looking for ammo. The levels are long. They're very complex. You do plenty of wandering, and there's a lot of them. There's a lot of levels in this game, and there really isn't any easy ones. Like, some are easier than others, yes, but they're all difficult. They're all more difficult than really any of Doom 1 and 2's levels. And it is worth noting there is master levels for Doom 2, which has some tricky ones in there, but it really just can't touch Final Doom when it comes to difficulty. Another interesting point about Final Doom is if you want to buy it these days, it actually has merged into other Doom games, and so if you buy really any of the old Doom games, you'll get Final Doom. Do I recommend you play it? Probably not. I mean, if you like really loved the original few Dooms and haven't tried Final Doom for some reason, sure, you can go ahead and try it. But otherwise, man, this game is just so brutally difficult that I don't think it's even worth trying. It's just stupidly difficult for the sake of being absolutely ridiculously difficult. It has all the hallmarks of old school difficulty, and if you're looking for a game that will absolutely test you, oh, look no further, you got Final Doom. And normally that's where I would end the video, but not today. Today's a little different. The real number 1 is not actually Final Doom. Final Doom, yeah, hard as fuck, but the real number 1 hardest FPS game is actually several games. Call it a cheat, maybe it's me copping out, but I think the hardest FPS is actually any sweaty, usually competitive FPS game. You know exactly what games I'm talking about. The Counter-Strikes, Valorant, Rainbow Six Siege, Escape from Tarkov, Overwatch 2, Arma 3, all of the competitive shooters. These are not only the hardest FPS games on the market, but the hardest FPS games of them all. All of the prior games I talked about were primarily single player games where you fight intelligent AI, you're put in unfair conditions, or you're just slammed by bullet sponge enemies, but all of that pales in comparison to other players. The AI and levels of the previous 10 games can only give you so much challenge. They really have a finite level of challenge. Multiplayer games obviously go far beyond that challenge. All of these games require a ton of patience, skill, precision, and usually godlike reflexes to get good at. I'm not going to act like I'm even half decent at any of these games because I'm not. It's hard to get good at any of these and really get anywhere. You gotta practice, it takes a long time to get far, you'll frequently have new setbacks that you'll have to overcome. And if you're like me, you just got way too many other games to play. But if you want the hardest challenge a first-person shooter can offer, play any of the competitive shooters. Sure, these aren't single-player experiences, and that's usually what I talk about, but it would be really silly of me to not see that the really difficult, truly most difficult FPS games are the ones where you're up against other players. Which do I think is the hardest online FPS game? I'm probably going to go with Escape from Tarkov. I mean, there's just such an astronomical learning curve, and I feel like it would take just dozens of hours to truly get even decent at. And then it's probably Counter-Strike or Valorant, where shooting patterns and map layouts really matter. Siege is hard because of the map layouts, and then any hero shooter is going to take some time to understand from the get-go because there are so many heroes to understand. Like, Siege has so many different operators now. It is crazy how many different operators there are from when I first tried the game. And then when the sweaties show up, oh yeah, it's gonna get real heated and real competitive. Of course, you can have some decent fun with all of these games, except maybe Tarkov, and you can be relatively casual, but the moment you move over to competitive, oh yeah, it's gonna be hard. And then you can bring up esports and how competitive that can be, and we'd be here all day, we really would. But I'm just gonna call the video here. If you're looking for the most difficult single player FPS games, Final Doom is definitely your choice. That is as hard as it gets. But if you're looking for even harder first person shooters that, you know, were actually commercially released, and certainly more modern ones than Final Doom, then you're really going to want to play a competitive shooter. I'm not going to tell you which is better, what you should play, but at the very least, it's great to see that if you like FPS games, if you like challenging FPS games, you have tons of options, plenty of options. And so that is it for today. We talked about some shooters. Let me know what you believe the hardest shooter is. Is it single player? Is it multiplayer? Let me know how you're feeling about everything down below. If you made it to this part of the video, you can comment bricks, as in what you throw through a window when you're mad at somebody, I guess. I don't know why I said that, but you know what? Bricks is the code word. If you made it to that part, I'll give you a heart. Thank you so much for just letting me ramble and go on and on. I very much do appreciate it. I hope you all have a wonderful Christmas. See y'all later. Bye-bye.